As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
In recent weeks, the whole world has been watching with bated breath the events unfolding in Canada. A country known for its commitment to democratic values and traditional alliances has unexpectedly taken a risky step that could change the balance of power on the international stage. Imagine, Canada, long considered a loyal partner of the United States, abruptly reneges on long-term arms purchase contracts with its North American neighbor and signs new defense agreements with China.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
But how did this become possible? How did a country that just yesterday was confidently holding course with the Western coalition suddenly decide to take such a step? And what lies behind this decision? What political and economic motives prompted Canada to abandon its traditional alliance with the US and turn to China?
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
On the one hand, one might think that this is a normal step in the context of changing world politics, where countries' interests can change course depending on circumstances. But what if there is something more behind it? Perhaps this is not just a search for new sources of weapons, but a deeply thought-out strategy to build new alliances that could affect global stability and even cause a reassessment of many international agreements. And, equally important, what consequences could this turn of events have for Canada itself?
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
While the US and Canada have traditionally been considered not only allies, but also friends in the field of security, relations between the two countries have recently become more complicated. Economic and political differences, as well as issues related to global security, have led the Canadian leadership to seriously consider new opportunities for its defense sector. And now, at this moment, China enters the scene. A great power that not so long ago was only an economic competitor to the West is now becoming a serious player in the arms arena. Canada, in search of alternatives, is entering into an agreement with China that could change not only their bilateral relations, but also the global power landscape. How did Canada, which until recently was closely linked to the US in defense cooperation, decide to take this step? What are the risks and benefits of such a partnership with China? And what does this mean for the world order? This is not just a question of buying weapons. It is a question of geopolitics, of the future of alliances, of a new reality in which global powers are beginning to align their interests according to a new scenario.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Let's take a look at this complex and intriguing world of international relations, where every decision can affect the fate of countries, continents, and entire regions. Stay tuned as we begin to understand what is behind this unexpected turn in Canadian politics and what consequences it may have for the whole world. Canada has always been known for its commitment to democracy, stability, and strong alliances, particularly with the United States. In recent decades, relations between the two countries have remained not only stable but also deeply mutually beneficial. As Canada's closest neighbor and largest trading partner, the United States has provided Canada with not only economic support but also security guarantees. The defense system, joint military exercises, and security cooperation have allowed Canada to remain part of the global Western alliance and feel secure on the world stage. However, as is often the case in geopolitics, times are changing, and what once seemed stable is beginning to crack at the seams. In recent years, relations between Canada and the US have become significantly more complicated. One of the factors that played a role in this process was the change in the domestic political situation in Canada. In recent years, voices against overly close ties with the US have become increasingly vocal in the country. Canadian society has begun to voice more criticism of the government, which has continued to depend on American supplies of weapons and military technology, despite growing dissatisfaction with US domestic policy, especially in the areas of ecology and human rights. Many progressive Canadian politicians began to put forward ideas about the need to review these relations, arguing that Canada's security should not depend on external pressure, especially when it comes to a government that does not always reflect Canadian values.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
In addition, economic tensions between the countries began to emerge, with repercussions in the defense sector. Trade disputes, tariffs, and dissatisfaction with trade agreements created pitfalls that could ultimately undermine the security built on decades of cooperation. The military cooperation with the US was threatened when one of the most important defense contracts was found to contain massive overpricing of weapons supplies, which caused discontent among Canadian authorities. Moreover, there was concern about the rising cost of new American military technology, while alternatives were becoming increasingly available on the world market. But even more alarming was the situation in the Pacific region, where geopolitical tensions were beginning to escalate. The US and Canada had traditionally maintained their military power in this region, but competition with China began to grow into a real challenge. With each passing year, China strengthened its military power, focusing on the latest technologies and actively developing its army. This created not only economic but also strategic pressure on Canada. In addition, against the backdrop of diplomatic crises with a number of countries, Canada began to feel that its political influence in the region was waning. In response to China's growing interest in the Pacific Ocean, the Canadian leadership began to seriously consider seeking new defense alliances and opportunities to modernize the army. It was in this context that Canada decided to cancel its arms purchase contracts with the US, which was undoubtedly a major step on the international stage. However, it should not be forgotten that such decisions are rarely unilateral. Behind this decision were not only economic but also strategic considerations, as well as pressure from both sides. On the one hand, Canada wanted to demonstrate its independence and ability to make its own decisions in the field of defense. On the other hand, there was a desire to find an alternative in other countries, such as China, which was beginning to play an increasingly prominent role in global security.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
When Canada began to consider China as a possible defense partner, it caused not only a wave of surprise but also strong criticism. Despite its strong economy and ambitions, China was not yet recognized as a global military partner for Western countries. However, the Chinese army has undergone significant modernization in recent decades, and military technology has begun to attract the attention of many countries. Canada, realizing that it needed to take risks to maintain its security in the New World Order, began to view China as a strategic partner with which it could conclude lucrative defense contracts. Many experts began to argue that Canada simply could not remain in the shadow of the US, especially in the context of the growing Chinese threat and the weakening of American influence in a number of strategically important regions. Signing a contract with China was an important step, which, according to analysts, was dictated not only by military needs, but also by the desire to strengthen economic ties with the world's largest economy. China, in turn, did not remain in debt and offered Canada favorable terms, including the supply of the latest technologies and weapons that would have been unavailable to Western countries just a few years ago. Interestingly, this move also provided China with an opportunity to strengthen its position on a global scale, forge new economic and diplomatic alliances, and perhaps even intervene in the North American sphere of influence. For several years now, China has been actively working on the development of new military technologies, including high-precision missiles and missile defense systems, which could significantly affect the balance of power in the Pacific region and even deter the US. Thus, Canada's decision to start cooperating with China in the defense sector has not only called into question its relations with the US, but also opened up new horizons for Chinese foreign policy. It is clear that behind this move lies the Canadian government's desire to ensure its long-term security, regardless of the changing mood in Washington and possible fluctuations in global markets. This turn of events not only caused an international stir, but also became an important indicator of how countries can seek new ways to strengthen their positions in the face of global instability. When Canada began looking for new ways to ensure its defense, one of the main factors that determined its course was attention to potential threats from China. In recent years, the situation in the Pacific region has become increasingly tense. China has been actively building up its military forces and introducing new technologies into its armed forces. In response, Canada, which has traditionally maintained allied relations with the US and NATO countries, began to consider the Chinese arms market as an alternative to American supplies. The reasons for this decision can be seen in several aspects, from strategic independence to economic and technological benefits. It is clear that Canada had its own reasons for taking this step. The US, as the main supplier of weapons and technology, began to become less attractive to the country in light of changes in its foreign and domestic policies. The US began to impose tougher conditions on its allies, and this could not fail to affect Canada. Economic sanctions, trade wars, and dissatisfaction with Washington's policies led Canada to finally decide to abandon long-term contracts for the purchase of weapons from the US. At the same time, the Chinese army quickly demonstrated its strength and capacity for technological progress, which led to growing interest in Chinese weapons.
In fact, the average US tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
By signing a contract with China, Canada took a step towards expanding its defense capabilities. China, in turn, was ready to offer Canada access to the latest technologies in the field of high-precision weapons, missile systems, and developing cyber threat protection systems. Chinese experts presented Canada not only with opportunities to acquire the latest weapons, but also with prospects for joint technology development, which could accelerate the modernization of the Canadian Army. Moreover, the Chinese side offered favorable terms for technological exchange, which would include not only the supply of finished products, but also the training of Canadian specialists. But there is another side to this agreement that has caused concern among the international community. Despite all the benefits that China offered Canada, cooperation with such a state inevitably entailed risks. The appearance of Chinese weapons on Canadian territory would signal to many countries that Canada was finding more common ground with the political adversary of the United States. Canada's NATO allies, including the United Kingdom and France, were particularly wary of this issue and expressed concern about the growing Chinese presence in North America. In response to these concerns, the Canadian government has tried to reassure its Western partners that its independence in defense decision-making will not be compromised, and that Chinese weapons will be used solely to strengthen national security, not to expand Chinese influence in the region. However, beyond foreign policy, Canada began to receive more and more positive feedback from those who saw the Chinese partnership as an opportunity for the development of national industry. Many Canadian defense companies, which had previously been limited in their capabilities due to the high prices of American weapons, began to actively turn to Chinese manufacturers. Unlike the US, China offered Canada not only competitive prices but also a wide range of high-tech products. For example, Chinese drones, which have become the basis for many military operations in Asia, began to represent a serious alternative to expensive American counterparts, which were available only to a limited number of countries. This also became a compelling argument for the Canadian authorities, who began to recognize that such technologies may be necessary in the face of modern threats. But what exactly could China offer Canada in the field of defense? First and foremost, it was new missile systems capable of striking at long ranges with high accuracy. China has been developing long-range missile systems for several years, which are actively used in Asia, and now offered Canada the opportunity to purchase them with a complete set of technical documentation and even participate in the joint modernization of these technologies. In addition, Chinese air defense systems, which have proven themselves in international markets, were offered to Canada as an alternative to American systems, which have become significantly more expensive and require a long time to upgrade.
And to these ends, The United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
However, not everyone in Canada was so optimistic about the new contracts with China. The opposition immediately raised the question of how this agreement would affect the country's relations with its Western allies. There were fears that such close ties with China could put Canada in an awkward position in the event of a conflict with Western powers, especially the US. The threats that could arise in the event of a geopolitical escalation led many politicians to wonder whether Canada would become the target of diplomatic pressure from its traditional partners. Nevertheless, the Canadian government continued to insist that the move toward China was part of a long-term strategy to ensure the country's independence and its ability to operate in the face of multiple threats. Canada sought not only to strengthen its defense capabilities, but also to modernize its military, which was made possible by the latest Chinese developments. In addition, according to high-level sources, the decision to cooperate with China was also dictated by the desire to balance efforts in the region and not depend on a single arms supplier. This strategic partnership was a turning point in Canada's defense policy. In the long term, it could lead to the creation of a new alliance in which Canada and China could cooperate, not only in the field of armaments, but also in the broader context of security and even economic cooperation. However, against the backdrop of growing wariness on the part of other Western countries, Canada risked finding itself at the center of a new geopolitical confrontation. The question of whether Canada can maintain its neutrality in the conflict between the West and the East remains open. The international community's reaction to Canada's decision to cancel contracts with the US and enter into new defense agreements with China was immediate and multifaceted. As might be expected, this move sparked a storm of criticism and concern, especially among Western allies. The US, the UK, and NATO countries, Canada's traditional partners, expressed their concern about its new course. In their eyes, this is not just a step towards China's political and economic sphere, but also a possible blow to the entire alliance system on which Western security has been based. Some diplomats have expressed the view that Canada's actions are effectively undermining trust in international relations by severing long-standing military ties with one of its largest and most reliable partners. In response, the Canadian government tried to reassure its allies, saying that the decision to cooperate with China was made solely in the interests of national security. Canada, according to its representatives, remains committed to democratic values and will continue to support international institutions such as the United Nations and NATO. At the same time, however, the government emphasized that, given the growing threats and instability in the Pacific region, it cannot remain dependent on a single source of defense technology and weapons. It was this independence and desire to guarantee the country's future security that were the most important factors in the decision to sign defense contracts with China.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Critics of this move from Western countries have argued that such a policy would put Canada in an awkward position in the event of a deterioration in relations with China. Many experts believe that this will not only affect diplomatic relations but could also lead to a real weakening of defense capabilities. As military cooperation with China will always entail certain risks, such as China's interference in Canadian affairs or even the use of Canada to achieve its goals in international politics. Many media representatives in the US and Europe emphasize that, despite all the benefits that the deal could bring, Canada's political and military independence could be jeopardized if relations with China deteriorate. But the international reaction did not stop there. While Western countries expressed their dissatisfaction, China, on the contrary, welcomed Canada's move. Official Beijing praised the new agreement and expressed its willingness to deepen cooperation in the areas of defense, technology, and trade. Chinese government officials said that Canada's decision would serve as the basis for a closer strategic partnership that would benefit both sides. China, with its growing ambitions in international politics, has decided to use this move as an opportunity to strengthen its influence in North America. This could be not only an important economic step, but also a major political victory, signaling to the rest of the world China's growing influence in global security. Equally important is the fact that such changes in Canadian policy have also caused particular concern among countries in the Pacific region. Japan, Australia, and South Korea, traditional security partners, have begun to actively comment on Canada's decision, fearing that it could lead to instability in the region. Their concern was that China's growing influence on Canada's defense could be used in the long term to promote Chinese interests in Canada itself or its neighboring countries. Canada's strategic partnership with China has jeopardized the entire collective security system in the Pacific region,